Many of you know by now that I'm a complete pedant, especially when it comes to world building. I absolutely love examining all the little minutiae of a fictional world's economy, geography, magic, technology, society, and then pointing out how none of it makes any goddamn sense. Seriously, it's extremely rare for any fantasy world to hold up under any real scrutiny. So in this new series, I'm going to be going into detail about shoddy world building in sci-fi and fantasy, as well as what exactly makes it shoddy. And to dispel the notion that I'm doing this just to be a hater or complain about inconsequential bullshit, I'll be starting off with a series that, despite what the clickbait title may cause you to believe, I actually really enjoy. The Ember Quartet. The Ember Quartet is one of the best fantasy series I've read in years, and it's the best YA fantasy. I absolutely love all the characters and their struggles, despite the occasional annoyance from Helene's lovesick pining or her inability to understand the actions of those around her, but there was something that was nagging at me from the first chapter of the first book. The setting. At first glance, the Martial Empire seems like any standard evil empire, albeit with a veneer of historical equivalence. People will see the word Kenturian and think, oh, I recognize that, it's just like Rome, even though it has very little actually in common with ancient Rome. But whatever, it's fiction. It's not like it's a historical novel treating itself as fact. But the more I read, the more I started to understand just how little sense the Empire makes. First things first, let's talk about the Martial Empire's geography, the foundation for their entire society. In the books, it's portrayed as a gigantic, continent-spanning affair held together by overwhelming military might. This plays into some historical misconceptions about ancient Rome, but I'll set that aside. The empire is primarily split into 4 general areas, which I'll call the Great Waste, the Tribal Desert, the Scholar Territory, and the Martial Heartland. The Great Waste has barely been mentioned in the books, but based on the name and the geography, it seems to not have many people in it. Same with the Tribal Desert. The Scholar Territory and the Martial Heartland are different, though. They both have rivers going through them. The benefit of this really can't be understated. River valleys are some of the most fertile land in the world, which allows them to grow more food and therefore have a much bigger population. And the Martial Heartland has a bunch of rivers all over, which allows for other things like irrigation and rapid transportation. So the Martials should have advantages that allow them to conquer their neighbors. This fits in pretty well with the information given in the books. The Martial army is shown to be both large and well supplied, after all. But outside of that, the Empire's geography doesn't work in its favor. The main thing that struck me about it is just how isolated it is. To the east, it's hemmed in by the Forest of Dusk, and to the north and west, it's blocked by mountains. The only lands left for it to expand into are the frozen borderlands to the north, which would probably not be worth the effort since there would be very little of value, and the native population has shown itself to be perfectly competent at fighting. This means that the Empire has no real room left to grow, which is a big problem for a militaristic empire. When you look at real-life empires, from Rome to Japan to the Mongols, their economies are reliant on constant expansion. The constant influx of plunder, natural resources, and above all slaves is what kept them wealthy and able to continue expending so many resources on their militaries. Once growth slows down, the entire economy starts to feel the effects. Let's look at slaves as a specific example. In ancient Rome, slavery was an integral part of everyday life. All those roads and aqueducts and temples, yeah, those were built by slaves. But they also performed regular duties like domestic servitude and farm work and mining. Absolutely everything in Rome depended on them. It's hard to overstate this. And their owners didn't need to worry about ever running out since there was a constant influx of them from Rome's foreign wars. In fact, it was often cheaper to work their slaves to death and then buy new ones than it was to take care of the ones they already had. This is something that the Martial Empire seems to have in common with its real-life counterpart. Slaves are used in everything, and they're cheap. Hell, the commandant straight up commits a genocide on them, but where are they coming from? The Empire doesn't seem to have any large-scale wars going on at the beginning of the series. The military is mostly used for policing the provinces. There are small-scale border skirmishes with the Carcounds, but nothing that would allow them to capture enough slaves to keep their economy running. And by this time, the Carcounds start a larger conflict in A Reaper at the Gates. They're beating the Martials in most every engagement, which means there's no way many of them were being captured as slaves. The Scholars can't be making up the slave population either. At first it might make sense, they're an already conquered people, but the majority of them are just an underclass, not full-on slaves. And if they did make up a majority of the slaves in the Empire, then they would be far more expensive and their owners wouldn't be so casual about killing or maiming them, since their source would be finite. In other words, the Martial Empire should have trouble keeping itself together even before Caris Veturia genocides half their population. On that note, I want to talk about the population of the Empire. In A Torch Against the Night, Helene's father asks her how many Martials live in the Empire, and she replies, 6 million. And this brief exchange, more than anything, inspired me to create this video essay. 6 million is too small. It's laughably small for such a gigantic empire. At its territorial and popular height in the year 164 CE, the Roman Empire had an estimated population of 61.4 million people. But wait, I hear you saying. Helene only specified that there were 6 million marshals in the empire. She didn't count tribals or scholars in that number. Not only that, but you don't actually know how big the empire is. It could be a tenth the size of Rome for all you know. This video is shit. Suck my dick, you faggot. Well, hypothetical YouTube commenter, let's examine those one at a time. The empire is undeniably huge. While there are no exact measurements given in the books, there's just enough information to get a rough estimate. At the beginning of A Torch Against the Night, Elias narrates that traveling on foot from Blackcliff to Cough Prison takes 90 days. Now, assuming he's talking about a normal pace, then the average person would be walking 3.1 miles per hour, 8 hours a day for 90 days. Then, since they're going over rough terrain, we cut their speed by about 25%. So 3.1 times 8 times 90 times 0.75 equals 1,674 miles from Blackcliff to Cough. That's 2,694 kilometers for all my metric-loving viewers. Hell of a trek, no wonder it took an entire book to make. Using that, I was able to measure the empire as best I could, and the grand total size of the Martial Empire is about 5,575,363 square miles, or 8,972,677 square kilometers. That is absolutely monstrous. The Roman Empire at its height was 1,699,000 square miles, less than a third the size of the Martial Empire. Hell, the Martial Empire is bigger than the fucking Spanish colonial empire. Now, I'd like to stress that this is just a rough estimate, but even if it's off by 200%, then the empire would still be way larger than its population would suggest. Now for the second point. The 6 million figure only applies to marshals in the empire and doesn't include other ethnic groups. That's completely correct, and it wouldn't be all that odd for one relatively small group to rule over a bunch of others. It's happened plenty of times in real history, especially when the smaller group has a technological edge. So let's look at the scholars, the first major group aside from marshals. The borders of their kingdom from before they were conquered are completely unknown, and there seems to be at least a little bit of a diaspora which confuses things further. So for the sake of argument, we'll say that the western border of the scholars' territory is in the Saran Mountains. The eastern border is the edge of the tribal desert, and the northern border is where the arid mountainous land gives way to plains. Not perfect borders, admittedly, but this whole thing is based on rough estimates, so you'll have to forgive me on that point. The scholar territory is about 547,320 square miles, or 875,712 square kilometers, which is larger than Peru. To estimate the population, the best method would be to look at the terrain and climate, then compare the population density to a place with a similar terrain and climate. The scholar's land is described as being pretty arid and full of hills and mountains, pretty close to mainland Greece. And according to Roman records from around 164 CE, the population density of mainland Greece was 17.92 people per square mile. That's 11.2 per square kilometer. Say what you will about the Romans, but they were great record keepers. But then we also have to take into account the river valley, which would easily double the population, and the fact that the scholars seem to be constantly on the verge of starvation, which would cause their population to stagnate or even shrink. We'll split the difference there and multiply the population by 1.5. So we put that all together and we get a total scholar population of about 14,711,961 people. The next group to look at are the tribals. For this one, I took the population density of another Roman province, Libya, at 64 people per square mile, and put it onto their massive territory of 1,165,747 square miles. However, I have to reduce this number for one big reason. The tribals are primarily nomads, which leaves them with much fewer resources to build up their population in the first place. In real life, most nomadic peoples have a population density of only around 1% of sedentary peoples in similar climates. But the tribals have frequent trade with the world outside their territory, and several cities are marked on the map, meaning there are at least some sedentary tribals out there. So we'll say that their density is 2% of Libya's, and then we'll add an extra 100,000 people just to be generous. So overall, the tribal population comes out to be around 1,592,156 people. So the Martial Empire's total population is only around 22,304,000 people. If it had the same density as Rome, it would have a population of over 140 million people. And that's about it as far as demographics go. There are mentions of a few mariners and barbarians in the empire, but they're in such small numbers as to be basically non-existent. The entire Martial Empire is made up of only 3 ethnic groups. This lack of diversity is really unrealistic. Even Italy wasn't ethnically homogeneous in antiquity, and the empire as a whole had dozens of ethnic and linguistic groups. Hey, here's a fun story. I initially did all of my measurements and estimates based on the map from my copy of A Reaper at the Gates, and then when I was looking for a map to use in this video, I found one that showed the Martial Empire as being quite a bit bigger than the map in the books. So I had to redo all the measurements, recalculate all the population numbers, and then rewrite a bunch of the script to realign with this new information. I hope you appreciate what I go through for you. So yeah, the population size and diversity of the empire are weirdly small considering its size. The idea of marshals controlling such small populations isn't strange, especially since they have a technological edge in their superior metalworking. The marshals' swords are so strong that other swords will shatter when they collide. My solution to that would be to use a shield to block them, or maybe a spear so I could stab an enemy soldier before he reached me, but I guess spending 500 years trying to find the secret to making ultra-special swords is a good plan too. So it isn't too strange that the marshals would be able to conquer the scholars and tribals. What is strange is that they're able to maintain control over them for more than a couple of years. The marshals don't have any sort of skill in governing or bureaucracy, and that's what brings me to my next point. I can hear some of you in the audience already dozing off, so let me assure you that this segment will be a lot more interesting than you think because it specifically deals with war and conquest, namely how bad the Martial Empire is at it. And this stands out so much more because it's supposedly based on Rome, a state that's famously good at integrating conquered peoples into their society. Rome was founded in 753 BCE, and it existed in some form from then until 1461 CE. That's 2,214 years of history. You can't last that long by using military force to hold your conquered peoples down and suppress rebellions. What you can do is make them not want to rebel in the first place. When Rome conquered a new land, they took slaves and resources, sure, but they also brought law and order to places that often didn't have it before. After being conquered, the Celts of Hispania and Gaul didn't really need to worry about bandits or tribal raids anymore. If you were a slave, then your life was short and brutal, but if you were made a citizen, then you enjoyed protections and rights that very few people in very few places would have had back then. Many people who had been conquered by Rome actually felt that they were better off than they had been before. Contrast that with the way the marshals treat their subject peoples. The tribal desert is said to be a protectorate of the empire, which means that it's a semi-independent territory that still answers to the emperor in Antium. This seems like the best arrangement for both sides, honestly. The desert is huge and the population is mobile, so the marshals wouldn't be able to effectively police the tribals or put down a rebellion. And on a more mundane level, collecting taxes would be a nightmare. It would be much easier just to demand some sort of tribute from the tribes every year and then leave them to their own devices. It's just better for everyone that way. Where the empire's governing structure falls apart is, again, with the scholars. Like I already said, the scholars are a conquered ethnic group that are completely subject to the whims of marshals. They don't seem to have any legal rights or protections at all. They're little more than slaves, when they aren't actual slaves, that is, and that's just not a sustainable system. There's a scholar resistance that's constantly harassing the martial army, and frankly, it's a wonder that it isn't much larger. They don't have to convince their fellows of any sort of ideology to recruit new fighters, they just have to point to the constant rapes and violence, and they'll be swarmed with volunteers. The lack of diversity in the empire might be strange, but it's also a blessing for the marshals. If they had to play whack-a-mole with rebellions from a dozen other ethnicities, then their entire empire would collapse in a decade. So altogether, despite the Ember Quartet having a great plot and characters, the setting makes absolutely no fucking sense. In some sci-fi or fantasy worlds, there are unrealistic aspects or inconsistencies that can be smoothed over with some sort of magic or technology, but that doesn't exist here. All the martial empire has is too few people, an inefficient government structure, and a strange lack of diversity given its size. However, this is still a great series of books, and it works as a lesson for aspiring sci-fi or fantasy writers. Don't sweat world building if it doesn't tie into the actual story. Even obsessed assholes like myself are perfectly willing to forgive flaws like this as long as the core is still enjoyable. If you've watched this far, thank you. I've never done any scripted videos on this channel before, and I'm interested in seeing how this one is received. This probably won't become the norm, my reviews will still be off the cuff, but if you like this format or have any other worlds you want me to look at, let me know and I'll do some more analysis videos like this.